and then you can start. Then you can. Yes, ma'am, you can start the meeting.
Rohit, the recording option is started on its own.
Yeah, I have actually started the recording on cloud, but for safety purpose, you can also record it on your PC.
But how do I do that? Because right now I'm getting an option of stop recording. I'm not getting an option of start recording.
Okay, then let it happen, ma'am. Let it record in the cloud. No issues.
You record it on
Yeah.
cloud and
So
will
Rohit, then after completion of the meeting, will we get the recording immediately? Is it like that the same how we get in another
Yeah, yeah.
Zooms?
Immediately you will get.
Okay. So where will it go? Will it come to me or will it go to the other persons? To
Whatever
you?
your email address you will be giving me, I will be sharing that
Fine,
record.
fine, fine. Salil.
Okay.
Will do.
So now you can start the meeting.
we can start.
Okay.
So should I start with speaking, or Medha, you were saying something about the university?
Yeah. Rohit, can we have the university song?
Yes, yes.
सुन्दरं मन्दिरं शारदाया उमापुरी विश्वविद्यालयम् इदं सुन्दरं मन्दिरं शारदाया उमापुरी विश्वविद्यालयम् कलाशास्त्रवाणिज्यशाखाविरूढा अमूढा विमुक्ता विहङ्गामयम् शृण्वन्तु सर्वे दृढं निश्चयम् शृण्वन्तु सर्वे दृढं निश्चयम् इदं सुन्दरं मन्दिरं शारदाया उमापुरी विश्वविद्यालयम्
Yeah, thank you, Rohit. Thank you, Rohit. Now, I request Dr. Mala Lalwani, Director of MACPP, Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy, to welcome the guest speakers and the participants and viewers. To Mala, please.
It's my privilege to welcome all of you to this webinar on behalf of the Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Jyoti Parekh, the resource person, the keynote speaker for today. For me personally, the name of Professor Jyoti Parekh brings back memories of the early history of Indira Gandhi Institute, a place where I have personally spent many fruitful hours in the library of the IGIDR, and having Professor Jyoti Parekh here brings back all those very pleasant memories. Also, the name of Professor Jyoti Parekh is someone who pioneered the general equilibrium approach to environmental economics. To begin with, I did do something in that area, but subsequently just moved way away. So very welcome, ma'am. Great to have you with us over here today. Welcome to all the speakers, the resource persons for today's webinar. Very happy that we have an interdepartmental collaboration in the university. So we have resource persons from the psychology department as well as from the philosophy department. Such interdepartmental collaborations are very few in the university, and I'm happy that our department is doing something in that area. And Dr. Medha is doing this for the second time, and I think it's a great initiative on her part. Happy to welcome the resource persons. Others whom she has got on board are from across the country as well as from across the globe. So great gathering that we have over here, and the stage is all set for a great webinar, I think, for over today and tomorrow. So welcome to all of you to this webinar. And just to start off the proceedings, just 2 minutes I will take to talk about our department, a little bit of background. So Professor Parikh, in fact, might remember us as being the Department of Economics and might be wondering as to how and why we have changed into being this Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy. So just for the others who are not, some of them have heard me time and again, but others who are new to this webinar, just to give a 2-minute background. So as the Department of Economics, we had, of course, the legacy of the Bombay School of Economics, which was very well known in the policy making arena with the names of Professor C.N. Vakil, Professor Brahmanand, Professor Lakdawala, Professor Dantwala. This is a legacy that we've grown up with, and we've heard a lot about wage goods model as well as the other kind of policy decisions. And we had Professor Lakdawala as being deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, where he got onto poverty measurement. With all that background, the Department of Economics, after we got autonomy in 2006, as we moved forward, we kind of thought that we would want to get back into the glorious days of the Bombay School of Economics, and with that in our mind, we renamed ourselves this new incarnation or rechristening as we called ourselves the Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy, where we tried to widen the ambit of our and the scope of our work, where apart from just being a traditional teaching department, we thought it would be good if we get back into the policy making arena and interact closely with other government departments as well as other multilateral agencies. So we are tied up closely with the Tribal Development Department of Government of Maharashtra, as well as with UNICEF. We are doing some very good projects which are on the anvil. So it was with this in mind that we kind of renamed. So it was more than just a name change. It was an ambitious meta concept. We wanted to be relevant. We wanted to be, known once again in the policy making arena. And we have taken some steps towards that, I think. And with public policy being our thrust focus, I think but in the area of environmental economics or climate change, the department really does not really have a big presence as it stands. In that context, I think the initiative taken by Dr. Medha Tapiawala to work in this very important area of environment and climate change is a significant one. And this webinar, which she has organized today, is yet another step in that direction. And hopefully soon we will be able to make our presence felt in that area too. So with that, I think I will welcome all of you once again and request Medha to take charge of the proceedings and formally welcome the keynote speaker for today and the other resource persons. So over to you, Medha.
Yeah, thank you, Mala. Thank you so much for these kind words. Now, this is my time to share the objective behind organizing this international webinar. As what Mala was telling, that this is a department which was earlier considered as Department of Economics, but now it is called as Mumbai School of Economics, is actually completing 100 years this time. And in this centenary years, we have got the opportunity to have series of programs, and this particular webinar, international webinar, is one in that series. Now, what has happened is before organizing this webinar, as any other event has got some stories, even this webinar also has a story. I know that this lockdown time was a difficult time, and many of us have used this time doing the things which we could not do when we were busy. Now, because of this lockdown, what has happened is many activities, many webinars, many lectures, sessions have happened. But I know that the webinars which have happened mainly on COVID-19 was discussing about the impact of COVID-19. But in this seminar, what we thought of discussing is about what is happening or to the environmental governance in the contemporary time. And this is because uh, uh, down the line, somewhere in month of March, when the first lockdown was announced, actually it was on 21st March, many countries were either declared a complete standstill or were moving on the same. The world became a complete standstill world by then. There were no cars on the road, no planes in the air, no coolers on, no lights of commercial centers. Manufacturing plants were temporarily closed. Offices, schools, university, all closed, as if it was a time please announced by the human activities. And during this time, NASA took one satellite picture of Earth. Now, this satellite picture showed that the degree of pollution in the air was unexpectedly low. Air, water, which had become clean. Pause of human activities gave chances to aquatics, birds, and animals to explore their lost space. And hence, we thought of checking the possibility of these paused human activities on environment. Climate change is is broader than environment in terms of its scale, complexity, and magnitude. Uh, Though it is more comprehensive, we experience it through the changing environment, which is indicated by generally the resources around us, like water, air, forests, land, soils, etc. Climate change is one of the most anthropogenic environmental impact. Environmental concern entered development, especially, I mean, a bit late after industrialization. As per Frankhofer and Stern, careful environment management is critical ingredient for poverty reduction for many countries. Because bad environment management results in environmental degradation, poor health, and loss of economic output, which makes many poor people more vulnerable. Hence, we need to have good governance, especially in terms of environmental policies. It needs a strong policy of state in place that supports the initiatives to achieve the objectives and provide a strategic direction, also suggest major actions that could even the Millennium Development Goals are now are transferred as Sustainable Development Goals. Now, these sustainable development goals are also considering environmental protection as one of the important pillar of a development process. To have clean energy, to have clean water, protection to the life in underwater and on the land, and climate actions are few of such sustainable development goals. After Paris Agreement, the majority of countries have made their environment policies to restrict the temperature rise above the targeted position. Hence, environment governance is based on the government structure, functioning, institutions, and the power relations. The decisions for protecting environment and good governance should ideally lead to sustainable improvement in the quality of life of all citizens. This webinar, which we are having as international webinar, which is organized for getting the insights of environmental policies and their governance in different countries and various parts in India. I'm happy to have these eminent world scholars for deliberations in these 2 days webinar. I am grateful to Professor Parekh to accept our invitation to deliver a keynote address. Now, let me give you a brief idea about who are our guest speakers. I'll just share my screen for a minute. So these are our the keynote address will be given by Dr. Jyoti Parekh, who's Executive Director of Integrated Research and Action for Development from New Delhi. He has the detailed biodata I will read just soon. The second person, the first speaker for this session will be Dr. Alok Saxena, who's a faculty of forestry and School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University. Then we have the eminent speaker like Professor Sudhakar Yedla from IGIDR, who's a professor at IGIDR, Indira Gandhi Institute of Development and Research, who was a former VC of Dravidian University. He was a vice chancellor. Professor Ashish Sharma, who is a professor at School of Civil and Environment Engineering at University of New South Wales in Australia. Then we have Professor Ashir Mehta, who's a professor in Economics Department at MS University, Baroda. Then we have Dr. Namita Nimbalkar, the faculty from Philosophy Department, University of Mumbai. Then we have Dr. Bassam, who's Dean of Albin Hussein Talal University from Jordan. A combined paper will be presented by Dr. Bassam and Dr. Krishan, who is a professor at Albin Hussein Talal University, Jordan. Then we have Professor Pranav Mukhopadhyay, Head of Economics Department from Goa University. Then we have Professor Satish Kumar, who is head of Psychology Department, University of Mumbai, and he will be presenting a combined paper with Dr. Juhi Deshmukh from Psychology Department, Savitri Bai Phule, Pune University. And finally, I will also speak few words about what kind of work is happening in department and what kind of work we are intending to have. So in this webinar, what we are expecting is to have more insightful discussions. Actually, there will be few question answers, and then we will also look forward to continue having discussions even in the future course of time. So I think with this, I request Dr. Jyoti Parekh to give her address. But before that, let me give a formal introduction of Dr. Jyoti Parekh. Professor Jyoti K. Parekh is Executive Director of Integrated Research and Action for Development, New Delhi. She was a member of the Prime Minister Council on Climate Change in India and is a recipient of Nobel Prize awarded to IPCC author in 2007. He was a member of Science and Technical Advisory Panel (STAP) for Global Environment Facility and a member of Decarbonizing Energy of World Economic Forum. Recently, she has been appointed as the advisor for Global Commission on Adaptation set by UN Secretary General and Gates Foundation managed by World Resource Institute. She was also a member of World Economic Forum's Global Agenda on Decarbonizing of Energy Sector. She has served as energy consultant to the World Bank, the US Department of Energy, EEC Brazil, and UN agencies such as UNIDO, FAO, UNU, and UNESCO, environmental consultant to UNDP, World Bank, and so on. She worked as an advisor to various ministries of Government of India. She obtained her MSc from University of California, Berkeley in 1964 and PhD in theoretical physics from University of Maryland, College Park in 1967. She has given lectures in more than 40 countries around the world. Her experience for nearly 40 years on environment and climate change problem of the developing countries is reflected in nearly 200 project research papers and 25 books and monographs in the area of environment and guided PhD and master thesis in climate change, climate modeling, environment economics, natural resource management, disaster risk reduction, climate mitigation, adaptation, as well as global negotiations. Her papers on climate change and agriculture were path-breaking and cited and referred many decades. Dr. Parekh served as a senior professor and acting director of Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, Mumbai from 1986 to 2003. International Institute for Applied System Analysis, Austria, for 8 years. That is from 1980 to 86 and 76-78, and Planning Commission as a senior energy consultant at New Delhi. So we are so happy to have Madam as a keynote speaker for our this 2 days international webinar. So I request Dr. Parikh to please take over and give your keynote address.
Thank you very much, Medha, for this introduction and inviting me to address this gathering. I'm really happy to be a part of 100-year celebration of Mumbai University. As you mentioned, first Indira Gandhi Institute was registered under Bombay University for giving out degrees. Then we got our independent deemed university status. So we have an old relations with Bombay University, Bombay University then. The climate change subject is has become so vast and so much multidimensional. And you asked me to emphasize that to the young people. When I began to think like that, and it just covers such a gamut of disciplines that during my conversation, if somebody starts writing and making a list, let's see, I challenge you to write how many disciplines it covers. So let's start with the scientific observations which were going on since actually 1850. The atmospheric science people were recording CO2 gases and many other gases. Then they observed that when CO2 emissions are rising, temperature is rising too. So the meteorologists came along and tried to verify whether it is true or is it just accidental, and that went on. And by 1980, 88, that 80s, from 84 to 88 or something like 80s, there were heated debates about whether this is a global phenomena, and very serious one at that. And and some people projected how much CO2 emissions will emit, then what will happen to the globe? And gradually it's very, creditable that those days that 90 really took momentum, and many other disciplines got involved, oceanography, forestry, to see what happens to the CO2 emissions and what could happen if the atmospheric changes start taking place. And so, whether geological sources can absorb it, forestry can absorb it, and it is really beyond the ecosystems control or not. So, it was clear that it cannot be managed and mankind would have to do something, and you can't just leave on to nature to absorb so much CO2 emissions. So, and that it resulted into a major conference, Rio conference in 1992, where, I was involved in this in 80s also, but much more before Rio conference, and we were there then. And the big debate emerged, but creditably of the many people's efforts that time, that heads of the state and nations, about 70 of them, though nations were present at 120, and Narasimha Rao and President Bush and so on, were all there to sign this agreement. And then there were other biodiversity convention, climate change convention, and people realized that we have to now start the sustainable development movement. So Agenda 21st Century on Sustainable Development was also launched then. So this is the brief history of climate change, where things started to get mobilized. That time we thought that main issue is mitigation, which means that how to reduce emissions. And basically, it's a fossil fuel emissions that were involved. Let us start with the sectors which emit fossil fuels. So the first sector that came in focus was power sector. That how can we not emit so much coal? Can we do with hydro, nuclear, renewable? And that time solar and was expensive and in fact not considered as viable solution, and we need to work a lot. So the entire power system consisting of so many types of sources, people kept evaluating it, whether we could shift to hydrogen and whether we could. So these discussions started in power sector, but then they realized that that's not enough. We need to also do other sectors, which is transport sector, which was growing very fast. So here there were different types of transport sectors. Can we use biofuels? Can we use electricity? Can we use, so these started debates in that area. And that time also continuing with non-motorized transport, public transport, all these are going on. I mean, so it looked very difficult because when you project these trends, they were leading to catastrophic proportions if we don't change. So the change was imminent, and then it came to buildings, and though at the same time, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you could see many of these evolution in chapters that were being discussed, and what was started with some 5-10 chapters or so has become now 19-20 chapters, new and new, more and more disciplines are coming up. The building sector joined soon, and how to do and again from most modern to the falling back to the vernacular architecture, where people used to have low cost materials and going to back to bamboo and so on. So and less bricks, less cement. These were also being discussed. So everywhere in every sector, people began to look for change, and for new impetus was given to practically every sector. The commercial buildings, how they can do in their basement, some vapor absorption systems and so on, so that the cooling loads can be reduced and so on. Then at the same time, much more work was being done on mitigation, thinking that that's our main thing, but main focus. But at the same time, almost by 90s, the effects started creeping in, climate effects. So people realized that adaptation is becoming a big issue. And that time, even in the 90s, people were discussing it's only 0.2 degrees, we can adapt to that, and why take such expensive options like solar and so on. Let's just tinker around adaptation. But that soon turned out to be a very negative way of thinking about it, just to tolerate the effects of climate change. So then in adaptation, they realized that agriculture is, of course, one of the first sector which would be really weather dependent. And there the farmers are, depending on rain-fed agriculture, always think of climate change as something that hurts them the most. And naturally, if the farmers are affected, then the whole society is affected also. And then people realize that there's a whole lot of impact on ecosystems of various types, and forests began to catch more fires, animals started to come out in the open much earlier. Bears were getting lost in March instead of coming out in April from their hibernation and so on. People began to observe these. And so you have biodiversity impact. Pests moved up in the Himalayan system, which they were not there before. And along with the pest came diseases. So the health effects started to enter, both health effects on human beings and on livestock and in wildlife. So that began to extend to that. So and we also began to look at different adaptation in a positive sense. This is actually what I mentioned is vulnerability. If they are all usually linked together, the vulnerability and resilience and adaptation. These vulnerable sections would have to adapt. Then came the many adaptation requires finance, and mitigation requires finance. So the entire economic work was of course going on in mitigation. How much will it cost? And then again, ethics and justice part, that who is emitting and who is suffering. Emitting people are usually rich. Even in India, they were rich people emitting much more, because those days our energy access was so poor that only 30% people mainly residing in urban areas had full comfortable living, somewhat, well, only 5% like the developed world, but many more, little more. So there is and when it gets very hot, it's the poor people who suffer, who have no fans, no electricity, no air conditioners. So there's a whole literature around ethics and climate justice, especially people in Africa were very adamant about putting climate justice in the negotiations aspect. And that started the linkage of poverty and climate change issues. Also, when I talked about economics, what is the cost of mitigation? What's the cost of adaptation? And how do you balance them? And how do you do that? Because do you do it for your generation, or you also look at the intergenerational aspects and leave this planet? So that also raised the issue of discount rate. Would you like to have discount rate of 0%, which is what the climate enthusiasts were arguing for? And some people say, no, this is just like any other investment, and it should have a proper market-based discount rate. That is now not considered very wise. People have understood that there could be several types of discount rate, and those which are urgent issues, we cannot talk about it as though it's a commercial investment. So that is settled, but after debates. I think that this, now let me also look at the agreement part of it. Now, agreement part, if you see, we started this Rio agreement, and that time there was a common but differentiated responsibilities. The Rio meeting really brought out the issues of consumption patterns and how consumption patterns differ from rich nations and poor people and so on. So for the first time, intragenerational equity and intergenerational equities started being discussed, and climate finance, who should pay for this, and who should be paid to both to not to emit and to adapt and so on. So there were other issues like climate Kyoto Protocol, and then Bali Accord, and so on. This over the time in Copenhagen, for the first time, they decided that you need a $100 billion fund for climate finance. So that time, it was going to be 50% for mitigation, 50% for adaptation, and that fund is there. It's moving very slowly, but it's doing. It's there. But now it's time to think bigger and also absorb this in our development patterns and not and how to mainstream climate change into all our decision making. So it's not that you can really separate, and there are talks about co-benefits. So if you build a building which is let's say loses less energy to outside, and it conserves energy, then your electricity bills go down, air pollution goes down, and so on. And similarly, about transport sector, less air pollution, and so on. So people started to climate and development, how to integrate, and this type of debates began to analytical articles balancing the two started coming. So I see that this is kind of what we started in 1990s with small community as well as small number of activities, expanded into a whole lot large of actors, actors ranging for, of course, governments got involved. But now we talk about state governments involved, urban, let me come to also now urban development. In urban development, sometimes these things are, people thought that in urban areas, people have air conditioners and it's the rural area which is more, in 90s they thought so. But now it's realized that millions of people live here. And in Mumbai, you are all familiar with the floods. The disaster resilience part of it is and disasters are increasing, both storms, floods, and landslides, and all the fires and so on that follow, and there are vulnerabilities also that emerge out of such incidences. So this started adding up, and when this happens in urban area, something like floods, we have seen it in Srinagar, in Chennai, and in Mumbai very regularly now, and with the ocean also sea level rise happening, I think that the Mumbai is highly vulnerable city. Even that time we had said that Mumbai is one of the very highly vulnerable, and the most expensive property is on the coast, and all the coastal properties, if you consider their value, even if you lose 500 meters to 100 meters, it's a huge amount given the Indian coastal line. And that came to some trillions of dollars. So this, and in terms of agreement, then Paris Agreement finally, people said, still the debate is going on whether historical emissions are important, future emissions are important, developing countries will emit more, and China has actually crossed the United States emissions, but luckily, or whatever you say, India's emissions have risen since what we started in 1990, from 0.2 tons to now almost 2 tons per person, tenfold. But yet we are less than world average per capita. So still more rise is expected from India. But luckily we have access to modern solutions. Our first bulb for many people can be LED bulb, which was still incandescent for many people who have not bothered to change bulbs. So in the developed countries sometimes. So so there we kind of leapfrogged certain areas. We also have seen, many people have seen solar energy as in place like Sundarbans and so on, where people have seen only solar lights. So that is the thing that we hope that such technological transition and leapfrogging, we can keep our emissions low. At IRADE, we did some modeling exercises till 2050 to show what can be promised for NDC. And we gave our modeling results to the ministry, and India has committed to do, what is known as GHG intensity, means the emissions per rupee or per dollar would go down by 33 to 35%, because we cannot reduce the GDP growth, but we can reduce the intensity of that. And we also are committed to having 40% of the power capacity of non-fossil fuel based. And Prime Minister has also announced 175 gigawatts by 2022 and 450 gigawatts by 2030. With falling solar prices, perhaps it's possible. So but now it's time to go to state level. There are industries are already looking after this, and they are trying to see what they can do, and some well-meaning industries are also committing to be net zero, means that whatever emissions they are emitting, they will absorb it or not emit it at all. So these changes, both behavioral and actual, are coming. So we hope that things will not be very alarming as some people think, but at the same time, it doesn't look like we will stick with 1.5 degrees or not. So I hope I have covered many multidimensional aspects of climate change as you were expecting me to. One last point, let me talk about COVID. I think COVID has made us aware that what climate enthusiasts were saying is not impossible. I was also thinking, and certainly in November, if you had shown us satellite imagery of what is going to come in 4 months, we would have said this is a science fiction. But and also that what happened in biodiversity area that Meda mentioned, and ecosystem area, clean air, water, animals coming out, we would have also thought that these romantic ideas are not possible. Air pollution disappearing, how is it possible? But it happened. So we have seen it like a movie in first hand in 5 months' time. So it gives us some hope that people can see it and change their behavior, so that it's not. It has made us ready for new ideas and new lifestyle. And this new lifestyle has been forced down to us, but then we have begun to see some aspects of it. Of course, it is coming. This is not a climate solution. It's coming at a great cost to the poor, but yet, at least for some, it's a wake-up call. And we can, while addressing to the problems of poor, we should still maintain the benefits of what we have seen. Only one big difficulty I see is the attitude towards public transport was getting better, but now it may not be as favorable to public transport, and that is a major challenge. But nevertheless, we will find ways to, and this COVID has made us realize that hearing nature is an important thing to do, and we need to change our ways. So thank you, Meda, for inviting me, and I hope I've covered the multidimensional aspects that you wanted me to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, madam. Thank you so much for touching up almost all the areas which we are intending to have deliberations in the future, I mean, coming 2 days. And really appreciate that despite of your ill health, you are still with us and sharing all these words of wisdom. No, madam, very appealing talks which you said about what is happening is initially we felt that climate change would have adverse impact only for the rural areas where agriculture is there and where poor people are there. But obviously in a country, in city like Mumbai, floods or in the place like Chennai or in other areas where the impact is also seen now. And additional to that, now the reuse of more energy, as you said, the renewable energy, as in Sundarban, what is they saying, so the solar the lights. So obviously that will give more chances of more the type of generation of employment, new technology, and so-called green technology would be obviously welcome. So, madam, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And it is really a pleasure to have you as the keynote speaker here, madam. Thank you so much.
I'm delighted to be here.
You have actually set a tone for our today's webinar. Thank you. So now our next session, we are going to begin where we are having our eminent guest speaker, Dr. Alark Saxena. Dr. Alark Saxena is an assistant professor of forestry and School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University. Alark is a social ecologist, a complex system scientist, and system modeler. Uh, his primary interests are in disaster risk reduction, climate change resilience, sustainable forest management, and poverty alleviation. Alark is interested in mainstreaming climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in development process of poor communities across the world. He is currently focused on developing techniques for evaluating resilience to shocks and stress, particularly in developing countries. Alark is also interested in forest biometric and is currently working on developing integrated landscape and livelihood models for forest landscape in USA, India, and Turkey. Alok research work is spread across the world. He has worked in South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Caribbean, Western, and Central Europe. In the Himalayas, Alok's work is focused on developing indicators for transboundary flood resilience between Nepal and India. He is also working on understanding the impact of tourism on the local natural resources, culture, and livelihood in the Sagarmat National Park, which is located at Mount Everest region in Nepal. Alok is also engaged in developing research projects on disaster risk reduction in flood-hit Uttarakhand region of India. Recently, Alok Research Group developed a landslide hazard map for Nepal post 2015 earthquake. Prior to his current position, Alok served as a program director of Yale Himalaya Initiative. He directed the Disaster Risk Reduction Initiative at Yale Global Institute of Sustainable Forestry. Alok graduated from the Indian Institute of Forest Management and worked with the MP Forest Department in India too. He has responsible for developing a number of alternative livelihood projects for poor communities living inside the forest of central India. Alok is also an international martial art champion. He professionally bred Dobermans. He loves riding his old motorcycle and is currently finishing up his private pilot license. I think very multi-dimensional person with us, and this gives me the great pleasure to invite
Such a pleasure.
Dr. Alark Saxena to deliver his talk. Alark, your time.
Wonderful, wonderful. Dr. Alark, it's really wonderful. Thank you. When I was sending my introduction, I didn't realize that I sent a 2-page introduction. I apologize
Not at all.
for
Not at all.
It is worth
but
mentioning, Alok.
Yes, yes, yes.
appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I wanted to start with thanking the organizers, especially Dr. Tapiawala, for giving me a chance to connect with you all. And it's also a great honor to share the with Dr. Parikh, who we have read and we have talked about and we have discussed and debated and whether that was right or wrong. So it's an honor to be in the same platform. And finally, just to kind of echo Dr. Tapiawala's comments, Dr. Parikh has set the presentation for my presentation very well. So I'm really happy to take on the baton from there and take it and express some of the things that I've been talking about. And just to kind of take a lead, so I would share my presentation if I can do that from here. Screen. Okay, I got it. And would you just give me a heads up if it's if the slides are on? Okay, I'm assuming that the slides are up. So the title of my presentation today is The State of the World, Taking Actions in the Anthropocene. And as Dr. Parikh had kind of given a deep history of how things have evolved from our discussions on issues of sustainable development to the current issues of climate change, I want to build on that. And so I'm really happy that I don't have to do the kind of pulling the history part and nothing better than having somebody who's actually been part of that history. So thank you once again. So I always do this presentation, and presentation style is called Death by PowerPoint, which means that I'm going to rapid fire slides at you. But I hope that the impression and the message that I want to bring forward comes very clearly. I'm going to start with, again, sustainable development goals. This is the, it's a omnipresent slide in every presentation now. But the point is that this is where we are. I mean, this is where 190 plus countries have agreed upon that these are the most important things that humanity has to agree upon. And so I want to start from here saying, how are we doing on these sustainable development goals? Whether we talk about climate change, whether we talk about other issues, it has to be spoken in terms of the common agreed goals across the world. I personally am engaged and very driven by the idea of goal number 1 and 2 from my own backgrounds from the city of Bhopal and Madhya Pradesh. I feel like ending poverty and hunger are still by far the most important goals. At the same time, at what cost? And who pays the cost, I guess, are the important questions. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk through some of the important findings that we've had from 2019. This is very, most recent report on sustainable development goals and how we are doing. So here is the slide that basically shows the current progress that we have made as a world. Here on the left side are different goals. How far are we from reaching those goals by 2030? Whether we are 5 to 10% away from it, whether we are greater than 10% away from it, or are we having negative trends? Now, what I wanted to highlight here is that we're actually doing pretty good in some of the indicators that are important to humanity, right? Ending poverty and reducing hunger, we are within 10% reach from that approach. Idea of child reduction in child mortality, infant mortality, we are very close to reaching the goal that the world has decided. We are very close to primary education. But on the right side, as you say, negative long-term trends, what I'd like to highlight is that many of the goals here on the bottom right, which are associated with environment, they are showing negative trends, which means even though the world has decided that we should have long-term environmental sustainability, the trends show a negative effect, which means that we are unable to achieve our goals. In fact, we're going in the opposite direction. So most of our discussion often ends up talking about development and how development is necessary for achieving those goals, right? And so economic growth has often been seen as an important session, and here an important aspect of our development. And here I just wanted to show how the world, on this left side is how much we have grown, the GDP has grown from 1980 to 2016, and who has benefited. Now, if you think about it, by now, sorry, my screen is constantly showing the bar. Okay, here. So by 2016, our growth has happened about 235%. But what you have to see is that most of the growth here has been captured by, the top 1% of the population, which is the most wealthiest population of the world. The top 1% captures roughly about 27% of the total growth. The bottom 50% only captures about 12% of the total growth. So there is disparity in how this economic growth translates to shared development of the community. On the right-hand side is the graph that shows inequality and intergenerational mobility. So if you're moving towards the right on x-axis, you're highly unequal. If you're moving up towards the on the y-axis, which means your mobility from with the place where you're born, it's hard for you to move above in a socioeconomic status from where your parents were. And what you see here is that even in the most developed countries in the world, some of the richest countries in the world are highly unequal. And also the intergenerational mobility is extremely limited, which means if you were born poor, you will probably remain poor. And a large section of the society does not have the benefits of the economic growth. So keep that in mind, that economic growth as a central perspective for many of these countries to share that growth to a larger society has not really come about as much as we want. Here is one of the success stories. We've tried to reduce hunger and malnutrition. The greens are Africa, orange is Asia, the gray is Latin America. And we were doing fine almost in 2016 or 2015 or so. The rates of hunger and malnutrition were going down in kids. And in the last decade, we actually have seen another increase in hunger and malnutrition, which means that there is something going on, that the efforts that we were making are no longer doing the same job that we were expecting them to, right? 45% of the world's children still die out of poor nutrition. And a large part of this population lives in the continents of Africa and certainly Asia. Here is a success story again. The education, children outside the school across the world, 27%, we've brought this down to globally less than 10% of the kids are outside school. But in the major progress has been made in least developed countries where 60% of the kids were outside school and now only less than 20%. So major progress has been made here. At the same time, just reflecting on Dr. Parekh's discussion, the GDP has come at a cost. And here it's basically showing the blue line is the GDP growth that we have achieved. And the brown line is the per capita CO2 emission that has come due to this growth. And for a while, from 1980s to almost 2000, we were doing fine. We actually were decoupling a little bit, where our GDP growth was not completely related to the emission, which means our production systems were becoming more efficient. But fast forward, and you see again an uptick in terms of both the GDP growth, but also higher per capita emissions that the world has seen. Here is another graph. This graph shows you, for the same amount of development, whether we have achieved socioeconomic thresholds. So if you're above this half on the y-axis, you have been able to provide basic social services to the basic necessities needed for existence to your citizens. And if you are to the right of the graph, which means on the x-axis, you have breached the biophysical thresholds that are necessary for maintaining environmental integrity. And what you see here is, by the way, here is India in the bottom left corner. Sorry, am I pointing it? Yeah, right here. And on the right side, top right corner is most of the developed countries. And what this graph highlights here is that most countries who have been able to provide have been able to achieve social thresholds, which means provide basic necessities for their citizens, have actually done by breaching the biophysical boundaries. And most of the countries that have not been able to provide enough of those kind of basic necessities, while they have not been able to breach the biophysical boundaries. And so what this graph is basically highlighting is that our current methods essentially are telling us that unless we breach those biophysical boundaries, we won't be able to achieve we won't be able to provide basic necessities to our citizens. And that questions our current mode of development and growth, right? If this is the reality, then, and if India decides to consume at the level of United States, then India alone will require 2.5 Earths, if not more. And so the current paradigm in which we are trying to discuss and provide basic necessities for human sustenance to our citizens has to be questioned. Here is a graph that's basically highlighting that you could reduce poverty rates either on the poverty rates by looking at changing the growth rates, which means if you increase your growth rates, you could reduce your poverty rates going down. Or you can change the policies that reduce inequality. And what these graphs are basically showing in this too is that by changing growth rates, the reduction in poverty rates is not as significant as if you change the inequality of a country, that you can get higher benefits if you are able to share and create policies that provide more equal opportunities for its citizens. Quickly moving on, we obviously, Dr. Parikh and the world now knows that majority of our consumption is essentially coming from urban areas. This slide basically shows that in 2019, 80% of global domestic GDP output was from urban areas. 75% of the carbon emission came out of urban areas. But what is kind of more shocking for me is that if you project the same trend for 2050, the current consumption of materials by urban areas, which is right now 40 billion tons, will increase to 90 billion tons, massively changing our landscapes, but also providing opportunities of where efficiencies and sustainability can be brought in. So the first part, essentially, I was telling about how we are talking about agreed upon state development goals, and in even those development goals, the environmental goals have actually shown negative trend. And if I may, I would bring forward the idea that even the development goals that we have really wanted to achieve have come at significant costs, and maybe we are not able to achieve even those development goals properly. So that's one question that I would like my honorable colleagues to be thinking about, and the audience that is listening to this. But here I want to kind of move from those development goals to, okay, what is happening to the environment, right? So how has development and human actions contributed to the state of environment? And these are the key concepts that I wanted to bring forward: issue of planetary boundary, mass extinction, pollution issues, and Anthropocene. Scientists have been talking about planetary boundaries. These are 9 planetary boundaries that have been agreed upon that are essential for existence and well-being of humanity. Here are these different things. Climate change is an issue, novel entities, which means there are things that we still don't know what's going on. Stratospheric ozone depletion issues, atmospheric aerosol, ocean acidification, biogeochemical flows of the planet, freshwater, land use change, and biosphere integrity. And what you see here is that if you are in the green, as we are, you are in the safe limits. These are planetary boundaries, so you're in the safe limits. Things are okay for you. But if you have moved outside these green, this inner circle, or if you're in the yellow sphere, it means that things are going off. Here is, it's a zone of uncertainty with increased risk. But if you have moved into the orange and dark orange areas, what you're realizing is that you have really breached the uncertainty. There is extremely high risk to human well-being as well as for just planetary survivability. And what you see is out of the 9 planetary boundaries, we have breached the biosphere integrity pretty heavy. We have breached the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles, and we have certainly breached the landscape change, land use change on our planet. And what it's showing is that human activities have created pressure on the system where out of the 9, 3 are already gone. And I don't know how many more we need to really learn how the planet's gonna respond to us, right? So it's showing, again, it's one more diagram that shows that there is significant environmental degradation happening. Here is the Global Forest Watch. If anybody is interested, I highly recommend. It's an online source which is essentially keeping an eye on global forests in real time. And all of these places which you are basically seeing, dark purple is essentially where we have lost forest cover. And that's actually quite interesting of how things are changing across, and especially these losses actually can be pretty heavy in the tropical region where highest amount of biodiversity exists. Article from Nature, and it's showing life under threat. On the left-hand side, we are talking about how many species have we already lost. And you've got mammals, you've got birds and amphibians and insects. And what's happening is that since we've started counting, we have already lost about 760 plus species. And what's kind of a little bit threatening or alarming is that they estimate that we are losing about 10 species a week. And there is a high kind of estimate, the higher estimate is pretty incredibly high, up to 690, which I would highlight is primarily because we don't even know how many species do we live with on our planet. And so the gray areas here are showing is the estimated predicted species that we potentially have as animals. We know almost nothing about fungi, so the microorganisms. Plant species, we've been able to do a pretty good job of understanding. And what it's showing here is that there is a significant amount of species that we don't even know. I'm going to go back to the slide. Significant amount of species that we don't even know what we're losing, which means that we can't even protect them if we don't even know what we are losing. Yeah. And again, the main threats as they are coming are again from exploitation, habitat degradation and change, and habitat loss. All of those can directly be connected to human activities. Which brings me to another point, which is that we have essentially moved into something called the 6th mass extinction. Now, a mass extinction happens, as is defined, when you lose 75% of all species on the planet. Geologically, we've had 5 mass extinctions. Again, these are in geological terms. But due to human action, today, we have essentially brought ourselves to a level where the species around us have only about a 50% chance. This is the graph here. They only have a 50% chance of surviving with us. And that shows something alarming about how much we have lost in our pursuit for growth and development. I'm going to quickly move over these species, the charts. Here, essentially saying that almost in every place across the continent, 56% of the species have lost more than 60% of their range. So, think about what I would say is if you were living in a 3-bedroom house, you have now lost 2 bedrooms and you're forced to live in 1. And so that's the pressure that we have pushed on the species that are with us. It's the same. This is the same thing. We are talking about endangered species, and almost all species have now a above 50% chance of endangerment. And this is through the IUCN classified list. And this really struck my thinking, which is to say that humans are just about 0.01% of all life, but have destroyed 83% of wild species that share the planet with us. And what you see here is a large livestock farm in Brazil. And what the caption again is saying, I want to just give an attention that 60% of all mammals on Earth now are livestock, essentially for human consumption. And it, you know, while we think about day-to-day issues, we may not be concerned, but when you start thinking about it at a global level, you are realizing how little our total, presence is, but how much footprint we have increased on this planet. Okay. So I wanted to, just for kind of giving, as I would say, a little bit of dramatic effect, I want to read some of these texts to you from Caballo's paper that talks about sixth mass extinction. And it says that, so Earth's sixth mass extinction episode has proceeded further than most assume. And I'm just reading the yellow highlighted text. When considering this frightening assault on the foundations of human civilization, one must never forget that Earth's capacity to support life, including human life, has been shaped by the life itself. That as much as 50% of the number of animal individuals that once shared Earth with us as humans are already gone, as are billions of populations. We emphasize that sixth mass extinction is already here, and the window for effective action is very short, probably 2 or 3 decades at most. All signs point to even more powerful assaults on biodiversity in the next 2 decades, painting a dismal picture for future of life, including human life. So I want to pause here and just have a reflection of what is the cost of our development right now and who's paying it, right? And who's paying both in terms of species on our planet, but also who's paying it in terms of, you know, the within human civilization, the haves and the have-nots. Who's paying that cost, right? This is, again, the state of pollution. I'm just going to keep showing these images that highlight where is the higher level of pollution. This is the PM 2.5 directly associated to how we use, biomass-based energy and also our production systems, whether they are clean or not. And what you're realizing, all these red areas, essentially all the developing countries are heavily affected by PM 2.5. And it's not it's no surprise to at least folks in India. We know how much I believe, if I'm not wrong, the top 17 of the top 20 countries of most polluted, top 20 cities, most polluted cities of the world now are in India. And it shows what's going on or how much efforts we need to make. This is the number of deaths per million directly related to pollution. And again, it directly shows, how much we or the developing countries are significantly affected by lack of clean energy and poor production systems. Yeah. So this brings me to my important slide, and this is on the issue of Anthropocene, that if you look on the socioeconomic trends here, world population rising up rapidly, you will uptake real GDP rising up. We've talked about foreign direct investment going up, primary energy use going up, large dams, water use, name it, right? Including international tourism and telecommunication. All of them are showing this rapid spike towards our time. And if you look on the other side in terms of Earth systems, carbon dioxide is showing the similar spike, nitrous oxide, as we've talked about in the previous presentation. name it, and all of the environmental degradation indicators are also demonstrating large spikes, and shows how much humans as have become powerful actors to change the planetary conditions which were otherwise only possible with geological forces and geological timescales, which begs to the argument that we have moved into something called the Anthropocene, that we have moved from a Holocene period, which was very congenial for human development, prosperity, growth, agriculture, everything was very predictable in our planetary system, to now Anthropocene, where we don't know what we are about to handle. And COVID is just another, another event that we haven't basically been oblivious to. So this is kind of my punch slide, that we have breached planetary boundaries. We have created tremendous destruction of biodiversity that only 50% chance is left for them to survive. And we have changed the planet to a level where humans can be directly connected, considered as a geological force. And that we, scientists, while they have agreed that we have moved into Anthropocene, they just don't want to say at what date we have moved to Anthropocene. But we are living in a geological era called the Anthropocene. So I want to bring it back to ground. Okay, so what does this mean for development and growth? And with the webinar essentially around environmental governance, this is an image of Cuyahoga River in United States in the early 50s. And if you hear the interviews of folks that were working here, they say that if you ever heard a siren or heard that the fire, that there is fire, you will run away from the river. It is, it's mind-boggling to think about it. You will run water to protect yourself from fire. Hello? That was when United States was going through tremendous growth and development. But fast forward, in terms of governance, this is the same river that used to, that has kind of revived itself, right? And it shows that nature has the capacity to revive, provided we give time to it. This is a jarring image that always boggles me, that our faith in our systems is so strong. Here we are doing Chhat Puja in a foaming river called Yamuna. And this is fascinating, that we have our systems in place that believe and pray to the rivers and natural systems, but we are also getting kind of oblivious of the environmental pollution, or we kind of put it aside. And that's something that, and when we talk about environmental governance, this is an important aspect. Same thing, as highlighted, COVID has changed. COVID actually has shown that natural systems can revive. This is the same river during COVID. So natural systems do have a capacity of revival, but there are important issues. There is a lag time for revival. Second, there is also the unintended implications of how we bring in solutions. We cannot, COVID has told us that environment can revive, but I hope we are not trying to bring another COVID to make sure that environment survives, right? And so these are hard and complex questions to ask. Again, climate change is, of all the things that I've talked about, climate change is another one. Here, this is the growth projection of different models that show how far our concentration can go. So there are different paths. This is RCP 2.6, 4.5. Basically, the red line shows if we are at business as usual, we are going to increase our level of carbon dioxide to a place where temperatures will be above 4 degrees Celsius. And it is black dot, which is what we have historically been emitting, shows basically that we are on business as usual trends, which means that we can anticipate ourselves to be at 4 degrees Celsius. What does it mean to have 4 degrees Celsius temperature, average temperature rise? Here is and this is an image from IPCC Working Group Working Group 2, Report 5. And what's showing is that as the temperatures rise here up, excuse me. All right. All right, so if these temperatures are rising, what it's showing is that at the bottom, the level of risks to these specific needs of our planet are extremely high, and we will have extremely high unintended consequences to our planetary system. This is the amount of budget that is total for keeping our under Paris Agreement to below 2 degrees Celsius. And this is how much we have already consumed, right? So we have only about 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide left for the whole world, right? 65% of our budget has already been consumed. So what it's showing is that we may not be actually able to fulfill our promise of staying below 1.5, below 2 degrees. Here is a projection that shows at business as usual, pre-nationally determined contributions, this is the trajectory of, the orange is the trajectory of how much the emissions are going to go. And even when countries have agreed to reduce their carbon emissions, even that is not sufficient. This is the blue line is the 2 degree scenario, if we are able to achieve 2 degree scenarios. And what this graph is showing is that our current emissions, even with the global agreements on carbon emission, are not enough. And our ambition level has been significantly low. Okay, I've been told that the time is running and I don't have we might not have time for question and answers, so I will move forward quickly. So in the definition of sustainability, I'm going to move forward quickly, that we have to move beyond just, sustainable development means social, ecological, and environmental sustainability. We have to think about integration at a higher level, and we have to move beyond technical fixes. So I'm going to move and skip some of the research arguments that I'm going to make, but focusing on research, especially around environment, has to focus on dynamic interactions between nature and society. And that the systems that we're dealing with are highly complex, they're non-linear, and they have significant lag times, which means even if we take the actions today, the intended benefits of those actions may take significantly long time. So I want to highlight this as an important argument, that if you're thinking about environmental research and governance issues, think about in this chart, the idea of not just doing research for the sake of research, which is highlighted by Neil Bohr's argument of finding an atomic model, or it should not simply be about research for the sake of immediate implementation, which is kind of highlighted by Edison's quadrant, which he was interested just in bringing light. But the research in environmental, especially sustainability, has to be kind of inspired the way Pasteur's work was, which is use-inspired science, basic research, where you're doing high quality science research, but also has a direct implication on humanity. And so I would want to put that in attention. I wanted to highlight that systems thinking is probably one great space for doing this kind of research where different disciplines can come together. And I wanted to highlight that the fact that when we are dealing with social and natural systems that are highly complex and they're embedded across different scales from local to regional to global, that we cannot simply look at simple solutions, and we should not treat human systems separate from natural systems, that they are highly integrated. And on top of it, as we are trying to think about research and governance issues, what we are looking at is something called complex adaptive systems, which means these natural systems and human systems are not simply dormant. They are responding to what kind of research and policy actions you're bringing in. So if that's the case, you have to develop newer methods of governance, which goes to my next slide of adaptive management. Now, it's not very fancy. People have been doing this again and again, but I think I want to highlight that when we are talking about governance, we should be thinking about uncertainty and surprise constantly, and not assume that systems are going to be stable. With that, in terms of management, we need to think about flexible policies, where each policy is essentially a learning opportunity, right? And that there is constant learning across systems. So I will basically leave it with this slide and just highlight some of the work that I'm doing. Within that limit of use-inspired research, we are looking at evaluating the biofuel potential of freshwater polluted systems in India. By the way, 85% of freshwater systems conservative estimate is actually polluted right now. Here we are looking at wood-based infrastructure to bring in back again in Nepal, which was devastated by earthquake. In urban areas, wood has become a new technology, and I would strongly encourage you all to think about wood again for building high volume, tall skyscrapers. So that's something new, and we are looking at the potential of that in Nepal. Here we are looking at governance models where we have three countries, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Indonesia. And we are looking at why, even with so much, with 20 years of knowledge that forests are burning, why is it still burning? So kind of integrating satellite information to local governance mechanisms here. And we are also looking at agrobiodiversity and food security issues in Bolivia, Peru, and USA. So finally, this is the last slide where we're looking at the role of forests and how forests have actually been helping in coping, helping the poor communities in coping during the COVID time. So that's all. Thank you so much for letting me speak. And I think I've been told to stop immediately.
No, it's not like that. But Alak, it was lovely presentation. And I think I'm sure you must have provoked so many questions in the mind of viewers. I'm sure that it must be bombarded with the questions, but unfortunately the time is very, very short and other speakers have already been waiting there. So if not here, but I'm sure that I can send you those questions by email, and then you can answer them on email and we can share it with the concerned people. It was wonderful presentation. And, basically this project, this webinar is also a part of our project, which we are working on environmental sustainability and communities' role in it, specifically tribals' role in it. So I'm sure this will be very useful for our projects too. Thank you so much for having it. And thank you so much for spending your time, even at this late time at your Arizona. Must be quite late now. Thank you so much.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. It is midnight sharp, and you have to get up at 4.
Oh my God.
I would be very gladly willing to move on, but thank you once again to everybody who has participated, and especially to Dr. Tapiawala for encouraging me to come and join you guys. And I wish you all the best for the next speakers.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So now we look forward to have our next speaker, and the next speaker is Dr. Sudhakar Yedla. He is, the biodata is the CV is very, very long, but I will try to read out few important points of this, but I'm sure if I keep reading this biodata, I think the entire webinar's time only will be spent in this. I'm so thankful to Dr. Yedla to accept our invitation and come here. Professor Sudhakar Yedla is a professor at Indira Gandhi Institute of Development and Research. Then he was earlier a Vice Chancellor of Dravidian University, which is a state university of Andhra. He is specialized in environment engineering and policy. He has 23 years of teaching and research experience, and his main focus is on waste management, climate studies, urban environment management, sustainable cities, sustainable mobility, provision of urban services, study and development of eco-industrial parks, environmental economics, valuation of environmental services, assessment of environmental and socio-economic impact of development initiative. There are so many prizes, awards which he has won, and he's been working. He's been appointed as a visiting professor at Cornell University, and he is also working as he has served in New Jersey Institute of Technology, Newark, USA, National Institute of Technology, Warangal, and so many. It just the CV is very, very big. But then to cut it short, I am very happy that we have such an eminent person here for our next presentation. And I welcome Dr. Yedla, Professor Yedla, to share his expertise here. Professor Yegla. So you will have to unmute yourself.
Yes. Very sorry. Good afternoon to everybody. Extremely sorry we have had to get used to this webinar styles of life. I thank Professor Medha for giving this opportunity, along with Dr. Namita, of course, the co-organizer. And as Dr. Saxena may leave anytime because it's midnight, let me thank him for his wonderful presentation. Very, very insightful and up-to-date information on various very important environmental issues that we have been facing. Thank you so much. And let me take it forward from some of the points that you have mentioned at a very micro level. For example, you talked about the species extinction and the patterns of that. Though I would not be talking so much detail into topics, I would try to see how this so-called COVID has changed our lifestyles and changed certain domains of environment for good. And what is the possible way we can take it forward from here? And what is that government should do in order not to miss this opportunity came our way all of a sudden unexpectedly in the of COVID, and how do we take it forward from where we are left with because of COVID. So let me share my presentation here. Can you see my presentation right now there, Veda?
Yeah, I think you'll have to double click the screen. Yeah, it's coming.
Full screen, we are able to see full screen, right?
No, not full screen yet. We'll have to start the slideshow.
Okay, yeah. Right. First of all, my sincere apologies to Professor Medha for not giving a proper, precise profile, and she had a hard time unnecessarily. I apologize for that. Going forward, as we all know, COVID is something an invited guest on this planet, and the impacts have been phenomenal beyond anybody's imagination. As we see the latest statistics taken it from yesterday's database, we have about 20 million people in the world being affected, which is quite large in number. No, not as big as Spanish flu and plague and so on, but it has its own significance in size. And as you can see, majority of these 20 million cases are coming, at least 50% of that are coming from 3 countries as listed here in the top 3 of them. And so is the deaths of 742,000 deaths we have that have been registered so far. Almost about 50% are attributed to these 3 countries. As you can see, the early runners in this crisis, Spain, UK, Italy, France, their deaths per million population are significantly high. That means as they are confronted with this pandemic in the beginning, there are certain disadvantages for the front runners in the pandemic. And they have seen that in very large deaths per million population numbers here, except in the Germany, which has handled it much better way. And they all happen to be kind of advanced economies, whereas the developing economies, such as India and to some extent Brazil, they have certain drawbacks in responding. Their tests per million population is quite low compared to other industrialized countries. Their deaths per million population are considerable, except in the case of India. As you can see in the case of India, just as marginal as 33 deaths per million population. When you pitch it against the maximum number of 685 in the case of UK, you find that something is extraordinarily different in the case of India in this pandemic. When we look at what exactly is that, as you see here, this is the global pattern of the cases, and this is the US pattern of cases. As you can see, the curve is kind of with exponential here, and the Indian case of total cases is quite flattened here. And perhaps this is the reason where we gained in the form of lesser fatalities. And as you can see here, number of daily cases also, there is a quick rise here in the case of US, and then there is some recession here, but then again they have the larger peak coming their way. Whereas in India, though the initial first cases have been registered around early February, but then we have a very milder slope here in daily cases registered as well in India. As you can see, there's a clear distinction between these two large countries, number one in the world and number three in the world, as well as number of cases is concerned. So what exactly did that magic is so-called the Great Indian Lockdown, now is become phenomenal in the world. Many people have praised it as one of the best lockdown regimes that any country could have ever thought of. Now, we had 4 different phases of lockdown, as all of us are aware, quite long in that sense. And then we have been attempting unlocking of this shutdown of the country in different phases. As you can see here, as the lockdown is in force till the end of May, the cases have been very, very marginal in their growth. But then the first unlock period, there is significant rise, but then the curve has been going exponential hereafter. Where do we go from here? It is still various predictions are there, but we now know where exactly we end up from here. But right now we are in this unlock period, unlock 3.0 from 1st August to 31st August. I think this is an error here, 31 days it's supposed to be. Now, as the result of Great Indian Lockdown, we definitely have an advantage. As you can see here, this flattened curve essentially is explained here as a better awareness among people. People responded better way than they would have been because of this lockdown, without exposing themselves for various risks that are coming their way. Higher preparedness for disease handling by the time the explosive growth has happened somewhere here. So by this time, the preparedness of the system has definitely improved. And then availability of better treatment protocols. Recently, one of my family members have gone through this COVID treatment, and I see that there's a very doctors are a bit certain about the treatment protocol that they should administer for different stages of the cases. Then we have availability of more effective drugs now, and that has flattened the infections, total infections. And then higher recovery rate. This is another very interesting phenomena that has been happening. Recovery rates have been increasing over a period of time. As you can see here, prompt clinical management has been resulting in higher recovery rate. Now, we stand as one of the highest recovery rates in the world as far as this pandemic is concerned. Then that resulted, the whole thing resulted in lowest fatality rate. As you can see from this graph, the average deaths fatality rate is 4% in the world, whereas India is half of that, and it is it's like as low as like UK has about 7 times the fatality rate that India has today. And as you can see here, the fatality rate has been low from the beginning, but then it is still coming down at an impressive rate. So this presents a scenario where lockdown has really helped India to fight this COVID, which would have been otherwise much deadlier on us. Some people did appreciate our lockdown, and a group of researchers from University of Oxford did say that this is one of the best and the most stringent lockdown Can you hear me, Meena? Hello. Hello, hello.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, sir.
Sorry, I think I got disconnected, or I don't know what exactly the problem, but can you please tell me where exactly I got disconnected so that I can start my talk right
Yeah,
there?
so the presentation has actually gone right now. You'll have to represent the presentation.
Share it, you mean to say?
Yeah. Please
Okay.
share it. Because
We'll
we
do
cannot
that
see it
right
right
away.
now. Yes.
Here we go. The share. Yes. Can you see it now?
Yeah. You can see it now.
So where did I stop exactly? Where did I get disconnected? Shall I start from here?
The previous slide, I think.
Yeah, this one?
Yeah, we were here.
Yeah. So I was trying to tell that the lockdown that was imposed kind of prematurely when only 600 cases were registered. The government of India has announced the lockdown effectively, and that has resulted in certain advantages that the country would allow to have. Availability of better treatment protocols and availability of better drugs. And that resulted in higher recovery rate for the country. And also the fatality rates have been registered as one of the lowest in the world. And because of that, lakhs of deaths have been avoided, and that was reinstated by many researchers around the world. A group of researchers from the University of Oxford said this is one of the stringent lockdowns in the world, and Boston Consulting Group did say about 1.2 lakh. Yes, please. Okay. 1.2 lakhs to 2.1 lakh lives were saved, whereas 36 to 70 lakhs cases were averted due to lockdown till the end of May 31st. So this essentially says that there is a significant advantage that India has accrued because of the lockdown in fighting COVID pandemic. Today we stand here with confirmed cases of 22 lakhs, the 2.2 million. Recoveries are fairly good, and deaths are 45,000, which is quite less compared to the confirmed cases here. Now, are we done with the peak of the problem? Doesn't appear so. Say United States has, for example, has a double peak. It has a rise here and then flattened a bit and then had another spell of higher growth in total cases. This is for the US. And as you can see, in this case, we have the active cases in the US is, again, there is a slackness in the slope here. Again, it is a rise here. And this is the daily new cases. Again, as you see, there is a rise and flattened curve. And then again, there is a steep rise here. And so is the deaths. Initially, there is a large peak, came down. Again, there is an increase in daily deaths that have been registered in the US. So this is an evidence of having second wave in the US, which is not observed in other countries, but it is there in the US. And if we observe the spread of pandemic in the country, these are all total cases registered in different cities, different locations in the country. As you can see, there is a wide cluster, close cluster here, there's a closer cluster here, and into Gangetic belt, there's a closer cluster here. But the midland is fairly not so much impacted by COVID pandemic as such. So that leaves us with the question, are we still going to have a wider coverage, we can say spread of this disease in the midland? If so, the number of cases and then fatalities would further rise. And then are we going to have a newer hotspot? Like the hotspots have been changing. Initially, it has started with Kerala, moved to Delhi, then Mumbai for a long time. Then Chennai, then Hyderabad became a hotspot. Then Calcutta started rising their numbers, and AP recently is the hotspot. And what next? Are we going to have some more newer hotspots emerging in the country, or are we going to go down the curve? So is there a possibility of a second wave, as in the case of the United States? So these questions are not answered as yet. There is no certainty about such things happening, but one has to brace up for that kind of progression of the pandemic. As we see this, definitely, yes, the lockdown has delivered the goods in controlling the disease or having controlled progression of the disease. Alongside, it has given some stronger impacts. Some are positive, some are negative for sure. To begin with, one of the major impacts we have seen is migrant workers. Thousands, maybe lakhs of people have moved back to their own towns, own villages, became jobless because of lockdown. There have been many deaths reported because of various reasons coming from this migrant worker group. There's a mass reverse migration that happened, which many people did not imagine that would ever happen. And that left slums with less loaded, Mumbai slums, for example, Dharavi, there are statistics saying that 40% Dharavi population has been vacated, so it is less populated now, so things like that. Economic growth is set to be at all-time low of 1947. The other day, Professor Kaushik Basu was talking about various scenarios of economic growth estimates. And yeah, one most recent one is say it is going down to the levels, new levels, never experienced levels of after 1947. Critically impacted small-scale industries and enterprises. That's is almost like paralyzed in the country. The industrial activity as it is has kind of slowed down and leaving many people unemployed. And this also exposed the healthcare system in the country. It is its shallowness and drawbacks have been exposed, and it's time we gear up for such kind of improvements of healthcare system. And most importantly, we being academics, I see the disturbed academic and learning system at the moment. Perhaps the students are the most affected lot of all sections of the society. And they have no certainty. They are into newer domains of online learning, which you had no idea of. The teachers are not aware of how to do that. So it's a completely messed up, uncertain system and time for the students. That's one of the major outcome, major impacts of this COVID as such. Now, the brighter side of it, improved natural environment. We see clean air, the control on air pollution, because there's no congestion on roads within cities, and less travel within cities. People stop traveling except for essential services. Then transport has been paralyzed. Low or no industrial activity in the periphery of the cities. So that left many cities with clean air. As you can see here, Delhi, of course, air pollution means that people think only about Delhi, fortunately or unfortunately. There are pictures showing the difference between COVID time and pre-COVID time, which is very pleasant to see as such. The vehicle, the roads, the cities are absolutely free. It reminds us of smaller European countries where sparingly you see a vehicle flying on the road. It's good to see that kind of a thing in our transport system, but of course that comes with a very huge stress on the system as such. Now, control over greenhouse gas emissions. We are working on it to quantify what exactly is the total greenhouse gas emission that we control in the country and globally because of this so-called 3-4 months of inaction in the world. That will be quite large, about 3 gigatons of GHG is emitted, and about 15 to 20%, depending on the country, comes from transportation. And even if you take 50% cut on the transportation activity, it gives you about 0.2 gigatons of GHG emission control only from transportation sector. That speaks volumes about the potential reductions that must have happened during this time towards climate change mitigation. No interstate transport of passengers, and that reduced freight movement and no air traffic essentially help control of GHG emissions as such. Reblossom biodiversity, we get to see cheetahs moving around the temple areas in the hills, like Tirupati, for example. There are cheetahs moving around on the the route to Tirumala temple. There are so many number of such incidences and reports that the fauna is actually coming out, and very glad to see the number of tigers increasing. Though I don't attribute the increasing number of tigers to COVID, but there is a pleasant reappearance of this fauna that happens that are spotted more often than otherwise. Yes, greenery is increasing. Of course, the data on forest cover, how exactly this inaction impacted forest cover, the data has to come at. We have no access to data, but there will definitely be some improvement on the trend as well. Then we have clean rivers, popular pictures that Dr. Saxena has shown the Yamuna River, where foaming is a common sight there, but then we find Yamuna much cleaner and flowing. Quantity of water, water flow has increased, the quality of water has improved. So all these things have been observed, not only in India, in many parts of the world. So improved self-cleansing capacity of rivers, say Ganga, for example, thousands of crores have been put into Clean Ganga Action Plan, but all that crore-studded action plan that could not do, our pandemic has done that magic. Now Ganga also, there are reports that a lot of cleaning has happened in Ganga water as well. So these are all the very good things that we get to see coming from this pandemic. Clear sky and picturesque backdrops, we get to hear that we can see the Himalayas, which we have now been able to see from far off cities. All those things, because the clear skies essentially is one good thing. We can feel, everybody can feel the freshness in the air when we breathe from our respective residences. Reduce the incidence of pollution-related health ailments. This is almost like 7th month or 8th month. We haven't visited a doctor so far, and it has never happened. With children around, especially upper respiratory illnesses are very prominent. Then we actually realized that all that was happening because of pollution. We don't have those complaints because we're not going out of house for the last 7 months. So these are the things we have observed. And then there are some more improvements in consumption habits. As we all know, any environmental problem, including climate change, is more related to consumption. Is there some chat? Running short. Okay. Let me quickly move forward. Maybe another 5 minutes. I'll try to say what I wanted to say. So there are certain improvements that happen in consumption patterns as well. But for environmental service provisions, essentially a collapse of waste management systems doesn't work right now, and menace of hospital waste is another big problem coming up our way, which is not yet felt at the moment, but it's going to be. So it reminds us the concept of sustainable living. What is that sustainable living? This is the kind of sustainable society index that was developed, which talks about different domains of the society: human, economic, and environment. And as I see, in order to achieve this, one has to have less travel activity, which was achieved by this pandemic. More of public transport. Unfortunately, of course, this is not yet started. Efficient fuels is another thing that adds to this. Decongestion of systems and cities is an extremely important thing, because congestion and intensification of activity results into contamination, pollution, wasteful resource use, and all that. Decongestion is something that has happened because of COVID. The augmentation of rural employment, the 20,000 crore package that has been announced has a lot for rural augmentation of rural employment, and then employability of youth in rural areas. Then have rural-urban symbiosis is an extremely important thing, not the rural-urban migration. And this seems to be speeding up. Efficient consumption patterns. So we have not been wasting the commodities right now. We have not been using the ration injudiciously. So there is a consumption pattern change that has been observed last few months in the country, which is required for sustainable societies. Efficient technology for industries. Yes, as we are restarting the industries, there is a chance for the government to enforce or insist on having greener and cleaner technologies in the industries, fuel efficient vehicles. There are a lot of initiatives happening. So there is a promise that was seen all of a sudden in the country with, for example, consumption pattern change. We could never ever imagine that it would happen, but it has happened in the last 4 months. Decongestion, there are a large number of failure cases than successful cases in decongesting cities, but we have Dharavi, whose population has reduced 40% because of this pandemic. So there are certain things which we would never imagine have happened, and those things, those happen is basically of our liking, but never happened. But now it happened in a different way, which we don't like, of course. But then how to use this experience to make those changes as per our liking in the framework. Now, as we see, this Dr. Saxena also has shown this one, explaining the interaction of these 3 peers essentially leads to sustainability. Now, we are reinventing the economic activity. Economic activity is at rock bottom. As we reinvent the economic activity, it is always possible to work in a way that this interaction with the society and interaction with the environment remains sustainable as far as economic sphere development is concerned. Similarly, finding transformational changes in the society, behavioral changes, it is possible to integrate those changes with the economic development that we're going to have, economic reactivity that we're going to have. So there is a possibility. So why shouldn't we try to attempt a sustainable ways while restarting the whole thing in a way? So that's the point of contention here. Internal sustainability, external sustainability are 2 different entities which have to be integrated for overall sustainability. The internal sustainability is the efficient management of the system that we talk about. If city is the black box, the city, the interaction of these 3 spheres within the city is one exactly internal sustainability. Then there is a possibility of addressing this internal sustainability in a much better way. Production and consumption, these 2 have to be handled in order to have sustainability in place. Production, as industries are going to restart their activity, it is possible to have a gaze on this production to have eco-efficiency. And consumption, the households have already embarked onto healthy consumption patterns right now. Energy consumption has come down, food waste has reduced, and so on and so forth. It is possible to augment it further and then integrate these 2 towards achieving sustainability. And I always liked the way the government of India has come out with the package to support various activities. There is quite a bit of it to self-reliance, to improve the self-reliance of the rural areas so that they work in symbiotic nature with urban systems, with rural systems as well. So, did COVID show us the way? Yes, it is. Unlearning a habit is the most difficult part of behavioral change, and COVID has, Medaji, I will wind up in 2 minutes, please. COVID has shown us to travel less for today's webinar. Otherwise, I would have traveled all the way to Mumbai University, but I could comfortably do it here. Do not waste food, and we conserve food. We don't do it anymore. We spend more time with families, eat less outside and unhealthy food, and honing of good habits that's important for inner good health. So these things have been happening. These changes have happened. And these changes in consumption pattern is the key for pollution control and fight against climate change and resources depletion. So the roads and transport used to be the backbone of the economy, and now sustainable and unsustainable consumption patterns used to be the strength of the economy. But then now we have a chance, we have tasted it also, that ICT, broadband, IT forms the backbone of the economy. And I think government has to take it forward by taking up certain strong measures, revisiting the national policies. For example, national urban policy has to be revisited to accommodate new regulations for slum management, new regulation for migrants management, and so on. So India needed a cultural change, and COVID presented that opportunity. Let us not lose that opportunity. Take it in a transformational change. This incremental change has to be transformed into a transformational change, and government has a role to play in that. And yes, we have newer work culture, work from home, video conferencing. Government has to support these things and see that these things would continue post-COVID as well. Control travel, possessing a personal mode should be made difficult, and use of personal vehicle should be made difficult because we have metros coming up. So government can work onto this to continue reduced travel activity on the road. More automation industry has to be promoted as we reinvent SMEs, new paradigm of improved industrial safety, then control and consumption patterns. And one more important thing with respect to environmental governance, I want to see this odd even policy in every domain, not just transportation. It can be the shopping, it can be theaters, so that the activity is controlled to some extent in an odd even formula. Provision of better civic services, include e-commerce. Government has to promote these things so that whatever we have observed in the last 4 months continues and gets into much transformational change. Newer system of academic instruction. I think this is another important thing government should work on too. Then health, new system of social and health security also has to be done. There are a number of things that we propose that will improve the environmental performance of the country. No motor vehicles in university campuses, for example. Introduction of stronger regime of recycling by promoting EIPs. So by doing such kind of long-term things, it is possible for Government of India to, in a way, transform whatever small change that we have observed into much bigger representative of the society level transformation to change. That's what is the message here. Finally, control travel activity of all types, make measures like that. Decongestion of cities and proper management of slums across states. Policies have to be made for that. Government of India has to come up with changes in national urban policy and should include some structural changes, such as density limitations on the cities, management of slums. If required, for migrants, limiting migration. It is time to government to realize that it is necessary to have controlled migration. Otherwise, situations like this will jeopardize our welfare. If required, constitutional changes can also be attempted there, but it's very, very important. That's what is the more realization now. Reinvent SMEs, groom behavioral change to sustainable consumption, and e-governance, e-learning, e-meetings to become an integral part of life. Finally, is this our chance to fight climate change? I think, as I said, climate change, though the efforts have been there continuously for a very long period of time, we could not have the dipping curves. And with this, I'm sure at the end of the year, we'll have statistics showing that the CO2 emissions globally has a dip here. Now, is this kind of nature gave us a lesson that yes, it can be done. This is how it should be done. So if you see, is this a chance to fight climate change? Maybe, I feel maybe yes. So let us reinvent the societies at this time in a more sustainable way, learning from what we have done during lockdown period of COVID. Government has to make certain strong policy changes, send strong messages to achieve this transformational change, which is more essential than ever for mankind and for India particularly. Thank you so very much for giving this opportunity, Professor Medha and Namita. Any questions we have, you can possibly send them. I will answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Yetla. I'm sure that this kind of topic cannot be wind up within such a short period of time, but I think online sessions also have limitations on time. That's the reason why I had to request you to. Thank you so much for such a lovely presentation, and I'm sure that this also must have provoked so many questions in the mind of people. But we will email you the questions, and then accordingly we can give the applies to them. Thank you so much for being with us. Now I request the other professor from Australia, Dr. Ashish Sharma, to introduce Dr. Ashish Sharma. Dr. Ashish Sharma is a professor in School of Civil and Environmental Engineering, the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. He is appointed on many positions. One of the important one is he is a president of International Association of Hydrology Science, Commission on Statistical Hydrology. He has completed his PhD from Utah University, Logan, Utah, USA, and he is an engineer from IIT Delhi. I request Professor Ashish Sharma now to take over. Professor Ashish Sharma.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can hear you, sir.
Excellent. So, I wonder if you can see my screen.
Yes.
Is it coming up? Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Mehta, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you to all of you for joining in on this webinar. It was quite an enlightening experience for me to actually hear the previous speakers, because I guess all of us come into such webinars with slightly different backgrounds and slightly different perspectives on the way things are. So my perspective over here that I will be talking about is related to climate change, and this is an area that we have been working a lot in the last few years. And basically, the title of the presentation kind of sums up my message over here. It says that if precipitation extremes are increasing, that means if rainfalls are getting more intense, you would normally expect floods to be increasing as well. But we and others now have kind of shown that that is not really happening across the world. I realize it is raining outside in Mumbai, and probably you would be having flood-like situations, occurring or soon to occur, possibly in that urban environment. But this statement over here is not a generalization. It is something that we have seen is occurring, and it has significant implications to all of us. Just before I go ahead, this work was done by Conrad Vasco, who finished his PhD a couple of years ago, and it's been co-authored by many others and around the world. Before I get started, let me just tell you a little bit about where I am sitting right now. So I'm based at the University of New South Wales. This is a map of Sydney. This is UNSW over here. For those of you who've been to Sydney, this is the Opera House. And UNSW is actually very close to a place which is very dear to all Indians, which is this place over here. And yes, you can guess, this is the Sydney Cricket Ground. So basically, we are right between, we are probably the same distance to the Opera House from the Sydney Cricket Ground as to the university. As regards Australia, it's got a very different, let's say, status in terms of water compared to the rest of the world. So when I was told to prepare this talk, I was told that it is to give a perspective about how water management occurs in Australia. So Australia is quite unique that it has, on a continental basis, the lowest average rainfall in the world, and only a very small fraction of that rainfall becomes surface runoff. Now, because of this, managing water becomes very critical, and Australia has fairly large storages for its relatively small population, because these are needed in order to maintain operations over here. But the focus of this talk is essentially about flooding. And this is something that has been discussed in this paper that was published now a couple of years ago. And the premise of this paper is that increase in temperature may be increasing rainfall extremes, but it is not necessarily increasing flood extremes. So the logic behind this paper is something that many of you who have an economics background would probably appreciate. If you look at temperature data from across the world, and if you just were to look at a simple trend across the temperature, the slope of this line is something that is positive. Now, when you start looking at an extreme variable, a variable that jumps around, takes high positive, high negative values with a lot of uncertainty, estimating its trend or rate of change with time is not so simple. So what I have over here is just a plot of some randomly generated data, which is supposed to have a positive slope. But basically, simply because of chance, you find that the slope is positive only on very few occasions. And this is the argument that I would like to make, that when people say climate change is not impacting rainfall extremes, it is because rainfall extremes, just by the definition of the word extreme, are notoriously unstable and variable. So to assess this change in extremes, we developed a slightly different means of investigation. We wanted to know the rate of change of extreme rainfall, which is the trend that is of interest to us. We know the trend in temperature, which we know is positive. So basically, what we started calculating was this term in between. And this term, broadly speaking, in climate, in the field of climate, is known as scaling. Now, the scaling is not very different to elasticity, which is a term that is used in the economics literature a lot. But basically, it is representing the rate of change of an extreme, not with a time variable, but with something that is changing with time. And in this case, it is temperature. If we look at our laws of physics, there is a law that is the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship, which basically says that every degree centigrade rise in temperature, your extreme rainfall should be increasing by 7%. But now coming back to floods, there was a paper that we published a couple of 2 or 3 years ago, which was quite unique in that it used data from across the world for over 5,000 catchments, which had good quality streamflow records, and they were free of two things. They were free of human impact and they were free of snow impact. So basically, the only thing changing in these catchments was rainfall. So this allowed us to assess whether our hypothesis that precipitation extremes are increasing is not consistent with change in floods, was possible, was true or not. So basically, I have a few figures over here, but they represent the precipitation scaling, which is the rate of change of P with temperature, and the streamflow extreme scaling, which is at the bottom. And essentially, if you plot the data from across the world, you see some patterns here. You see a lot of red in the top, and you see a lot of blue at the bottom. So basically, it is trying to say is that the rainfall extremes across the world are actually increasing, which is on the right-hand side of this color scale that you have over here. Whereas the streamflow extremes are generally on the negative side. This is inconsistent or kind of contradictory to what has been reported in most IPCC reports in the past, but our results are fairly difficult to deny because they are not based on any model. They are just based on raw data that has been collected from across the world. So if you were to summarize this thing up, you basically have a fairly complex story, which is representing a curve in red for precipitation that is scaling roughly at the rate of 7% as you get to really extreme rainfalls. Whereas for floods, which is the three curves at the bottom, they are scaling negative. And to summarize it even further, if I first just look at the very rare extremes, these are the extremes that cause damage, destruction, death across the world. What you can see is that the flow scaling is increasing and it is roughly approaching the rainfall scaling. That means the big extreme floods that do cause death and damage, they will increase because of flooding. And this is especially the case for all urban catchments. This is what you have been seeing in Chennai, you've been seeing it in Mumbai, you've been seeing it in Venice, Paris, all over the world. All the cities are drowning because of this. So basically, the conclusion from this part is that urban flooding will increase and will impact more and more as urban populations increase. That means you have less and less green spaces and more concreted areas. But if you look at a different part of this figure, these are less extreme rainfall and flood events, you will find that rainfall is generally scaling at a far greater rate than stream flow. And this difference is basically accentuated if you look at low percentiles. That means not very extreme, not life-threatening floods, but less than that. So basically, a larger rainfall peak can be expected to result in a lower flood peak. So you might have an increase in rainfall, but the actual flow that will come down the river will be less than what you used to before, and totally contradictory to what you would have been expecting because your models are trained to simulate the higher peak. Now, one other very interesting result in here is that if you segregate these findings for small catchments versus fairly large catchments, I mean something like the Ganges Basin or the Brahmaputra Basin, small catchment would be something quite small, barely 1,000 square kilometers. You find that the small catchment stream flow is increasing, whereas the large catchment stream flow is clearly decreasing. And what could be causing this? The only thing that could be causing this is that the storm moisture, the moisture conditions in the soil in a larger catchment are much drier than what you have in a smaller catchment. So basically, large catchment floods are reducing because the soils are drying up over there. The soils are drying up in a smaller catchment as well. But those soils are less important in a small catchment because the rain overwhelms the wetness of the soil very quickly. In a large catchment, that is not possible. Now, the reason this becomes scary is this. With every degree increase in temperature, you're seeing on average a 10 to 15% reduction in moderate flood events. So extreme flood events, which were the flood events that are on the right-hand side of this figure, they are increasing, but they are not very relevant from a water supply perspective because these floods cause death and damage. They are not stored in dams. The dams normally let the water out because they are not designed to store the water in very extreme situations. What they actually rely on are these frequent floods. These frequent floods are the floods that fill up the dam each year and supply water to our farmers and to our cities. And these seem to be reducing by 10 to 15% for each degree rise in temperature. What makes this matter worse is that dry soils also means that farmers will be needing much more water. So that means the demand from these dams will be increasing a lot beyond what it is in current levels. And also these higher temperatures also imply that you will be losing a lot of water that is stored in dams. So on the whole, we are basically having a double whammy. We are having an increased risk of flooding that causes death and damage, and an increased risk of water scarcity that reduces our ability to supply drinking water and water for irrigation to maintain our lives. Now, this is a slightly complex picture, but basically this is supported by other studies as well. So if you look at the top, let's say the highest flood event occurring across a number of catchments in the United States, what you would find is 36% of the time, the annual maximum rain results in the annual maximum flood. But if the catchment is wet, this number changes from 36% to 62%. And when the catchment is dry, it changes to 13%. Now, what I'm arguing over here is with increase in temperature, you will be having fewer wet situations, fewer instances of catchments being wet, and more instances of the catchments being dry, which basically means that we will be having essentially much bigger reductions in flows that can be trapped for our use for water supply purposes. So I'm an engineer, and I mean, I can talk about these problems, but at the end of the day, we are supposed to deliver solutions. And my students basically ask me a lot about what can be done in this scenario. So these are basically my own thoughts. This is not coming from any manual or anything like that. We have two options ahead of us. The first option is to wait for greenhouse gas concentrations to reduce, which is an option that I appreciate very much, but I realize that that is not going to help us immediately, because currently the chances that we will contain warming below 2 degrees centigrade, which is supposed to be the tipping point, is essentially about 5%. And this is not me saying, this is a paper in one of the nature journals that came out a couple of years ago that says that, look, it's hopeless. 2100, you would have, the coral reefs would be gone, Venice would be drowned, a lot of things would have happened. So basically we are stuck. Whatever we do, we can't undo this situation. We have to think about other ways of controlling this problem. So what is the other way of controlling this problem? Well, we have to just go back in time. How did we handle water insecurity before? And the way we have done it is we have engineered our planet. Now, I know this is not a very, let's say, popular word, engineering the planet, but the reason we are living in these beautiful cities that we are living in is totally because of engineering. So this is an example of how water is stored that supplies water to all of us from dams. This is an example of desalination plants that is supplying water in most coastal cities. This is what all the rich countries are investing right now in. This is a scheme that I visited last year in China that actually transfers water up to the northern part of China, which has been designated as the future farming belt because they realize that this is the only way they can feed their population later on in time. So this is a north-south water transfer scheme. If you look at flooding, this is what is happening in Venice. But you look at Netherlands, half the country is underwater, another engineering marvel. So basically what has been done is they have prepared dikes and they have used them over the last 50 years, very costly options. But how do you save a Bangladesh from drowning out with a 1.5 meter sea level rise, or a Jakarta from doing the same thing? These are questions we have to think about. This is what London is doing. I was in London earlier this year, just before COVID locked us all down. And this is the Thames Barrier. This is how they protect themselves against the tidal surges that come into the city. This is another example of urban flooding. This is a picture that not many of you would be familiar with. After the Second World War, Tokyo was pretty much flattened out, and they knew that Tokyo had a problem with flooding. So what they did was they created this massive underground reservoir under the city of Tokyo. This reservoir is flooded and filled in every time a tidal flood happens, and then pumps are switched on and the water is released. Now, I know this is very costly, but it is possible. It has been done before. This is something else that is happening. This is happening in China, where they are demanding that any new cities that are created, they act like sponge cities. That means they ensure a certain amount of area is consigned to absorbing water. Now, I know this absorbing water is not going to help us with our life-threatening floods, but the nuisance floods, the small floods, is something that can be controlled with that. So basically, to just conclude, how do we get around this situation? I think the first thing we need to recognize is that it all starts by being honest about our risks and our vulnerabilities. And this is something that we can probably say we have not been till now. We have not been completely honest as to what is the implications of this whole thing. Discourse with all types of professional, all types of stakeholders. One has to have a bipartisan commitment towards long-term sustainable solution. And finally, this is basically what I feel it finally comes down to. We have to look at the past, see how we have succeeded in re-engineering, ensure we don't repeat the mistakes we have made. Okay, learn from our mistakes, and we start re-engineering. And that's all that I have to say. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashish Sharma, for this lucid and very informative presentation. I am sure in Mumbai, we have to learn many more things from these kind of engineering infrastructures. Because Mumbai is very prone to, even today, the weather is very bad and we are very prone for such kind of floods. I'm sure that this kind of infrastructure would help us also to defeat flooding. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now we proceed to, once again, the questions will be emailed to you, sir. Yeah, now sure. We proceed with the next presentation. And next presentation is by Dr. Ashir Mehta. Dr. Ashir Mehta is...
Yes, Ms. Mehta.
Yeah, just a minute. My internet got stuck.
Oh, no, no problem.
Dr. Ashir Mehta is a professor of economics at Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda. He is ex-member of Senate of MSU. He has 30 years experience of teaching and research. His PhD is in international development economics, special interest in environmental economics. Several publications at national and international levels. And he's already guided 4 PhD students, and there are 5 more still continuing with him, and on structural and decomposing analysis of environmental Kuznets curve. I think this is much relevant to what we are actually discussing today. So I request Dr. Mehta to please take over.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta. It's a pleasure to be back virtually at Mumbai University, because I remember I was there in 2017 and for a week almost, and it was really a very enriching experience. Today also, it's a pleasure to listen to the experts in the respective fields, especially from overseas, because otherwise physically probably you might not get a chance to meet them. But online, this kind of webinars gives you an opportunity to interact with a lot of overseas experts. And honestly, I'm very impressed, because each one of the experts are, masters in their own field. Compared to them, probably I consider myself to be a sort of, how should I put it, kind of a novice, because I am really not engaged in too much of, these kinds of analytical work, because most of our times, most of our time gets into, teaching, and research becomes a byproduct, so to say. But whatever little that has been achieved is because of my personal interest. And in environmental and natural resource economics is something that I hold very dear to the heart. It is also a pleasure to see Professor Jyoti Parikh after a long time, because I was, there are a lot of nostalgic memories of IGIDR that I have. So what I have, at the same time, I must also put in a clause here, qualify myself by saying that, it's a kind of a sort of a hasty collection of points that I have made, looking at the experience that we have undergone of the pandemic. Because we have online classes also going on, and the university is now, planning to hold the online exams of the final year students. And I don't know whether you've read in the papers or not, just about 10-15 days back, our university website got hacked, because we were planning to hold the mock test 2 or 3 days prior to the actual online exams. So students get acquainted with the whole online system, because this is the first time that the MS University has gone in for online examination system. But the university website got hacked, and there were a lot of questions that we had uploaded. A lot of them disappeared from the website. So it was like, first of all, we had to prepare the MCQs and then upload, and it's actually a terrible thing. But nonetheless, now things have sorted out, and we are now in the process of announcing the other dates for the online exams. Anyway, fine. So what I've done is, assorted a few random thoughts on what lessons we can learn from the pandemic. The name itself suggests that it's basically a global phenomenon that we are encountering. So any action in one part of the globe will have repercussions on the other part of the globe, because it's a pandemic. Okay, so it started in China, and then it spread across the world. If there's a solution to the pandemic in any corner of the world, it will ultimately disseminate and dissipate to the rest of the world. So policy, I personally feel that policy and governance has to, first of all, begin at some central level, central in the sense at some global level. That's the feeling that I have. And then, kind of permeate to the local or the regional level. So what I have here, let me just share my content. Just give me a minute. Okay, somehow the sharing option doesn't seem to be working. I don't know. Are you able to see the screen? I don't think so.
No, sir, not yet.
Not yet, no. So somehow I'm... Just a moment. Yeah. Okay. Just give me a minute.
Yeah, we can see now.
Yeah. Okay. So Right. So some of the thoughts that I have had regarding some of the lessons that we can, really implement and, as early as possible. The first that comes to my mind is that, being a disease that spreads from wildlife to humans, it is important that these kinds of high risk markets need to be either regulated or controlled or altogether be closed. Because when all kinds of live and dead animals are being sold across the markets, and with going into different foodstuffs, with close proximity, then obviously there is a possibility of cross contamination, because we have seen that most of these markets are unhygienic and unsanitary. So the first issue of governance that comes forth is to try and control these high risk markets, and this is not just at the local level, not just at the local or the regional level, but at the global level, because there would be trade in these kinds of species also, and these kinds of foodstuff also. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. The second, at what we have seen in this pandemic is that initially, people were very happy to see nature on the roads, to see an animal or a bird species that they have not yet seen so far, and suddenly you find them walking on the roads, and it was very fascinating and it was very enchanting for people to see that. But what is important for us to understand is that, just as we felt that pleasure, we need to incorporate that pleasure and that relationship with nature into our policy making, into our attitude towards nature. We need to transform our relationship with the natural world, because only when we realize that nature is much more important than man, would we be able to kind of reduce the risk of disease. So we find that many of the drivers of biodiversity loss are like kind of deforestation and habitat conversion. So when you see, I've been in IGIDR, so I know this. I mean, there are a lot of wild animals that roam around in IGIDR at night, and we have experienced that. So it's not that they are encroaching on our property. It's actually we have been encroaching on their property. So we have to understand that. We really need to understand that. So it's deforestation and habitat conversion and fragmentation, and all of these factors, unregulated trade in species, as I just mentioned, whatever trade that we have in species as food and medicine, and to the extent that we end up over harvesting these species to the brink of extinction. Dr. Ashish talked about, I think he talked about the 6th extinction. So that is really a major issue here. So, the other governance issue that we should be highlighting is that whenever you have a policy making, or whenever we have strategies to combat these pandemics, on how to govern, we need to bring in this whole element of our relationship with nature. Okay, that's the second point that comes to my mind. Sort of at the cost of being a little repetitive, social policy, environmental and social policies. I think also one of the slides showed people's, doing Chhat Puja. Again, Dr. Ashish mentioned that and showed a pic of that. So our social policies are, also kind of make it much likelier that a previously harmless microbe will cause a devastating outbreak. So our environmental and social policies need to be revamped and need to be revisited, keeping in mind the pandemic impacts of our, haphazard or unthought of environmental and social policies. So you need to have a kind of a paradigm shift. There is this One Health movement. This is the link if time permits, we can go to that, which actually talks about the connections between people, animals, plants, and their shared environment. So we are basically sharing environment with the nature. It's not that we are superior to nature and we are kind of allowing nature to flourish and blossom. No, we are not allowing. It's nature that is allowing us to survive. And at any point of time, nature will hit back if we really try to subdue and try to control nature. Biodiversity loss, yes, this has been talked about, so I probably will not be dwelling too much on that. But again, deforestation, yes, the migration, the second point, movements of large groups to new locations, often under poor conditions, increases displaced populations' vulnerability to biological threats. So, in this pandemic also, we've seen, mass exodus and mass migration from one place to another. The question remains whether, they would have been safer where they were, or they are safer after migrating or during the migration. That's a question, because then vulnerability increases, because mass exodus would mean people come in contact with each other and, they're exposed to the threat much more than if they were safer inside where they were. Okay. Even in a city like Baroda, for example, where I stay, the students, and I'm giving you first-hand experience, that students were asked to leave the hostels. Whereas I felt that probably they would have been safer here, and not asked to go to their own places. But then, there would also be an issue of how long this pandemic is going to last, and what about the resources that these students or the people, because there are no jobs available, and it would be a question of survival. Okay, so that also is on the other side of the coin. But nonetheless, the vulnerability increases because of movements of large groups of people to new locations. This actually now is a time where you need a lot of increased research and development in being prepared for these kinds of pandemics. God forbid if we ever experience this again. But one of the lessons that this pandemic has taught us is that we actually need much more research, and not just research, a one-time research, but it should be on an ongoing basis. The reason being that this particular virus, COVID, has undergone a lot of mutations. So by the time one particular vaccine comes out, it could be for a particular mutation which has already gone. And by the time the vaccine comes out, there would be a newer mutation. So the research and development that we need has to be on an ongoing basis, and looking at, studying these different mutations that are coming about. And therefore, you need innovative technologies, which are critical for new vaccines. Okay, so just a one-time vaccine or a one-time research will not suffice here. Air quality, particularly when the pandemic is airborne, then air quality also needs to be one of these strategies, combating or reducing the bad air quality becomes another target point. And therefore, the second point highlights the issue of continuation of home working and increased spaces for pedestrian and cyclists, more frequent public transport services to avoid crowding, and improvements in indoor air quality, and all those things. So basically, we need to kind of trying to avoid or minimize a peak in the pandemic. So this is another lesson that we have to because we in India, it's difficult to kind of find space for pedestrians. The reason is very obvious. It's the population. So you go to a bazaar, or you go to a vegetable market, or you go to a mall, it's like chock-a-block. Okay. Now, in that situation, how do we think of increasing the spaces for people? Okay. How do we actually enforce or implement social distancing? Okay. So there, you need to think about that also. It's important to kind of, have a strategy which tries to, combat these kinds of congestion and these kinds of lack of space. As I said, being a pandemic, you need certain steps at the global level also, because it's a global pandemic, and therefore some of the suggestions that could come about is in terms of a sort of a global safety insurance framework, where you have some kind of a global insurance for a pandemic, where anybody at pandemic risk, any nation at pandemic risk, can these kinds of safety insurance can be availed of. Some kind of global public good, if not it's global, at least regional, mainly in order to kind of deploy massive health response in order to mitigate. And because in the early stages, it's important to try and step up our resource availability and deployment of resources at the initial stages, so that we try and mitigate or minimize the rapid spread of it. So that is kind of, you need this pandemic also gives you a lesson of coordinated multi-level governance and federalism. What happened in the US, some states and some provinces were very effective in controlling the pandemic, whereas some provinces were not. For example, Florida. So, the policies are left to the concerned governor of that particular province or that particular state. Okay. But then there are certain policy responses or strategies that need to come at a central level and have to be abided by, have to be followed, irrespective of the structure of governance. Okay, because of these interjurisdictional problems, you need to think of some a coordinated multi-level governance, which begins at some apex level and then has to be followed through at the lowest level. So both at the policy making and the adaptation level, your environmental governance becomes a part of a dynamic project making. Reforestation, of course, is an issue because of the loss of biodiversity and deforestation, and some kind of investment in low carbon, climate resilient growth is important, mainly in order to create jobs, whether it is reforestation or land degradation or buildings insulation or whatever. Okay, so these are some of the issues in terms of recovering jobs that have been lost due to the pandemic. The businesses need to also think of some voluntary measures to kind of safeguard nature, and the business houses need to recognize that it's the natural resources and the ecosystems that ultimately power their business. Okay, and once they come under a huge strain, then it affects the businesses also. As the studies show, that nature-based solutions can provide up to 37% of mitigation. Okay, so these are some of the random thoughts that I had, and try to just systematize them. But these are more immediate issues that I thought we should be thinking of as lessons from the pandemic. That's about all that I have to say. I thank once again Professor Mehta for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much. That's all that I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this short and very to the point presentation, sir. It's really very nice. there are some questions, but I think I will, again, as I said to others also, I'll pass on the questions later
No
on.
problems, no issue. I'm sure there would be quite a few questions here.
Yeah,
I know that.
there are, but I will
Yes.
write, I mean, I will pass those questions to you on
Sure.
Thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
So now we have another eminent person to speak. He is from our own Mumbai University. As rightly told by Dr. Parikh in the morning, this is a multi-dimensional, multidisciplinary area. And that is why now I invite Dr. Namita Nimbalkar from Philosophy Department of University of Mumbai to make this presentation. She has 20 years of teaching experience. She has written a book on Gandhi, Quest for Revision and Communal Harmony. The 10 international publications and 11 national publications on her credit. She has many projects completed by now. And now we together are working on a project which is a study of belief system, environmental practice of Sahyadri zone tribes with special reference to Warli. So now I request Namita to take over and start her presentation. Namita.
Thank you, Dr. Medha. Thank you, Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy. Thank you to all the speakers who have spoken prior to me. You people have really given us a lot of food for thought and deliberations. As Dr. Medha has very rightly pointed out, that basically what Dr. Medha and myself, we are working together on an ICSSR IMPRESS project under which this particular workshop is being organized. We are working on a study of belief systems, environmental practices of Sahyadri zone tribes with special reference to Warlis and Borkois. As a result of this particular project, it gave us an opportunity to interact with tribals in the districts of Thane and Palghar, which is in the state of Maharashtra. We restricted the project only to these two particular districts. And this is where the issue of governance for me arises. The reason, or rather the topic that I'm going to speak on, is how the tribals were brought into governance through Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996, that is PESA. So my presentation would basically be on PESA and a very brief history of scheduled tribes and so on and so forth. I'm aware that the time constraint is there, so I would be skipping a lot of things which I would have otherwise discussed in detail. So when we speak of governance, we find that basically by various thinkers, there have been given 8 pointers for it. And I wouldn't be going into the details of those 8-point factors of governance, but the first and foremost one which is there is the participatory form. And when we talk of participatory as far as the scheduled tribes areas are concerned, we find that somewhere there is a need that good governance and development should not be based exclusively on economic growth. There is something much more beyond economic growth, wherein we have to think about when we speak of good governance. In respect to the tribal areas, we find that it is with regard to the protection of human rights, equitable distribution of wealth, enhancement of individual capabilities, creation of an enabling environment to foster participation, and as well as the growth of human potentials. If this categories or if these aspects can be taken care of, then we can say that somewhere we are speaking about good governance. However, most of the time what happens is that we restrict governance to urban areas. And when we talk of urban governance, what my study has pointed out is that there are key core 4 elements. And these key 4 elements are the interface which takes place between the city and the center or the nation. At the same time, we also talk about the municipal capability or capacity. We also find that there are many private sectors which play a very key role in urban governance, as well as political systems and institutions. Now here, I find that a very fundamental question can be raised. And this fundamental question is that whether the laws of urban governance can be applied to the indigenous population of the world. The answer is an emphatic no. The reason for this is that there is cultural, educational, health, economic, social, psychological, emotional, and environmental issues and problems of the indigenous community which are very much different from that of the urban population. So when we speak of governing the tribal population, we find that there is a need for a different set of laws and legislations which will be peculiar only to them, or which will be catering only to the requirement or to the need of this particular population. So in this particular regard, when we speak of it in context of Indian society, and we speak of in the context of tribes in India, we find that as compared to the world, or rather we can say that India has the second largest tribal concentration in the world. And it has, we find that it is basically concentrated in forest and hilly regions, but natural. The characteristics of these communities which is there is very particular geographical locations. And they have very distinct culture, which is not the mainstream culture. And one more important factor for them is that there is a lot of economic backwardness and aloofness from the society at large. Now, in the Indian context, how do we say that which particular area will come under scheduled tribe area? What are the criteria which is used to define that an area is a scheduled area? So we find that as far as the government, or as far as the term of scheduled areas, which is defined in the Indian Constitution, it is the preponderance of tribal population. It is the compactness and reasonable size of the area, and whether the area is underdeveloped, whether there is a marked disparity in economic standards of the population. Now, in our travels, in our visits to the villages which I had undertaken in Thane and Palghar district, I found that the socio-economic and cultural life of these tribals, they varied from tribe to tribe and region to region. We are undertaking study on two tribes, the Dhorkoris and the Varlis. So there is a difference between these two tribes also. There is a difference in the socio-economic standards, in the cultural life of these two tribes. And we find that again, what came to our notice was that there is a very distinct pattern of economy, technology, and religious behavior. And also, these tribes, they speak large number of languages and dialects. So when I visited certain villages in Palghar area, I found that even within those tribes, the 3 to 4 tribes which are concentrated in a particular village, they have a distinct dialect. And this diversity in their lifestyle, or their mode of life, it shows, it points to the great similarity in their socio-cultural and psychological level. And there is a strong urge in them to retain their separate spatial identity, to retain their social identity, customs, and regulations. So, though this thing are there, yet what I found, or what our study indicates, is that even prior to what you can say, the even after the independence of India, but I would also go a little back prior to the independence of India. We find that the tribal disposition has taken place for the past 150 years. And we have to recognize that the Britishers, when they ushered in forest laws, it was not for the conservation of forest. It was not for environmental conservations. Their prime interest in introducing the Forest Act in 1865 was very exploitative, and it was aimed at establishing a monopoly over forest resources. So the impact of this forest law was very tragic, and the fallout could be seen on self-governing, self-respecting tribal communities. So forests for these communities were not only the sources of livelihood and sustenance, they were also a way of life, a way of worship, and a way of staying in touch with themselves. I belong to the field of philosophy, so much of my presentation or much of my way of looking at all these aspects will be from a philosophical perspective. And so I could see that there is a sense of loss as far as culture is concerned, as far as the way of life is concerned. And very interestingly, we found, like, the history which is there, it shows that these tribal communities, they revolted repeatedly against the British and local exploiters who took away their forest land. It is worth noting that the first major forest legislation was passed in 1865, and the Indian Forest Act, as we know today, it was passed in 1927. Now, when we look at the gap between these 2 years, that is 1865 and 1927, we find that in between these years, there were numerous tribal uprisings and revolts. I will not be going into the details of these revolts and uprisings, but unfortunately, what I found and what we are aware also, that even in independent India, many problems facing tribal communities remains to be addressed. Settlements of forest were made, but the rights of forest dwellers were not settled. So you can see the differences between the two. That is, settlement of forest is decided about. But what about the rights of forest dwellers? Are we really confirming the rights to them? And then we find that estimates suggest that while the percentage of scheduled tribes in the population of India is around 8%, not a small number, their percentage among those displaced for development projects range from 40% to 55%. This is a staggering number, 40% to 55%. The burden of development fell disproportionately on the shoulders of our tribal brothers and sisters. And unfortunately, we also notice that the fruits of this development doesn't reach to our tribal brothers and sisters. But taking this into consideration, we find that, like, with this background, I would now come to the act which is made for them. And this act is Panchayat's extension to scheduled areas. So there was an amendment which took place in the year 1992, and this is the 73rd and 74th amendment in the Constitution. And this amendment took place after incorporating many path-breaking provisions for effective local self-government practices. And we find that though these amendments were there, these amendments were not automatically made applicable to the scheduled areas. And the reason for this is the unique characteristics and special needs, and as well as the special features of the scheduled areas and tribal people. There was a Bhuria committee which was set up, and this Bhuria committee submitted its report in the year 1995. And as per this report which was submitted, we find that PESA or PESA Act, which is there, that came into consideration. Now, what is this PESA Act? And how does it help in governance? This is the key question that I'm going to address. So, and why is self-governance essential? So this will come subsequently in my discussion. So when we find that this PESA or Panchayat's Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, which was finally enacted in the year 1996, for the very first time, this act gives radical self-governance power to the tribal community. And it is self-governance. And it recognizes its traditional community rights over natural resources. Now, when we look at prior to the passage of this act, we find that the laws which were passed by the central government or by the state government, they were mechanically applied to tribal areas. Even when these laws, these laws were not in sync with the tribal practices and institutions, but mechanically they would be applied without giving much thought that whether it is really working for them or not. However, under PESA, we find that the law which is there, it focuses on settlements where the tribal people themselves perceive to be traditional and organic entities. In fact, this particular law is the first of its kind, wherein it empowers people to redefine their own administrative boundaries. But this PESA becomes all the more important in governance because it empowers the tribal communities to approve all development plans. It empowers them to control all functionaries and institutions of all social sectors. And more importantly, it also empowers the tribal communities to control all minor water bodies, minor minerals, and non timber forest resources. At the same time, the tribal communities also have the authority to control land alienation, to impose prohibition, and also to manage village markets and resolve international conflicts. So, what happens by this act is that there is a space which is created, and this space is created for people's empowerment, for genuine popular political participation, for convergent community action, sustainable people oriented development, and auto generated emancipation. When this act was enacted, it was looked at that this act has a lot of potential, a potential to fundamentally transform governance in tribal areas when colonial and independent India adopted policies that facilitated the exploitation of natural resources and alienated the tribal people from their land, forest, and resources. So when this act which is there, very importantly, it goes beyond the provisions of the Panchayati Raj Act of 1993, and it gives special autonomy and power to the people and village level institutions for local governance, conservation of natural resources, and preservation of their traditional rights over the use of natural resources. So we find that so this could broadly be interpreted to mean that the two principal colonial crises or causes of tribal disaffection, one, the failure to recognize community propriety rights over land of tribal communities in the Indian Forest Act of 1927, and secondly, the many glaring oppressive features of the 19th century Land Acquisition Act. This could and should be amended to bring them in line with the letter and spirit of PESA. However, though this act have been enacted, let me tell you that despite its potential to transform scheduled areas, PESA was hardly implemented for a very long time. PESA rules were not published in most states for a very long time. State legislations which were there, they remained out of line with the letter and spirit of PESA. The autonomy of ownership over minor forest produce was not fully protected by local laws. Due cognizance was not taken of local community practice and cultural traditions. While we chart the way forward, we therefore need to reflect that the collective failure to implement PESA, what are the reasons for it? We also need to examine whether the provisions of the Forest Right Act have been implemented keeping in spirit with the letter and spirit of the legislation. And what is noticed is that there is a strong resistance among a particular segment of the bureaucracy to come in line with the new paradigm of community ownership of natural resources, and this is basically a reason for major concern. Now, it's now the onus is there not only on the government, the onus is also there on the role of the civil society. So governance is not there only between the state and the, there are many actors when we speak of governance. There are many participants when we speak of governance. So civil society also has to play an important role in bringing about political participation of people and in preventing the political abuse of power. And what also we notice when I was interacting with many of the people over there, and it's like, when these people approach the government offices, so the people at the administration at the lower level, they use these people, they have used them as a tool of manipulation and again, let me tell you very interestingly, when within a particular village there are many tribes, so the dominant tribes which is there, the privileged groups which are there, they get more benefited out of this act rather than the ones who are there in the minority in a particular village. At the same time, the reason for this PESA Act not to be enacted in totality or for people's participation to be less is the lack of knowledge, the means and methods of approaching people, the absence of support, as I have mentioned, that from the higher level authorities, and of course the general apathy which we find in the local level functionaries. So when I say that the decentralization, or when we speak about governance, so like when we talk about this act which have been enacted, it is essential that the success of the decentralization program lies not only in the deconcentration of functions, finances, and powers, but also yes, I'm coming to the conclusion, but also a change in the attitude, behavior, and cultural conditions conducive for the growth of decentralization. And this, I feel, that it can be brought about only when we talk about the participation of the people and the participation of the civil society. So, to put it in another way, to ensure good governance in tribal areas, we have to ensure self-governance of tribal communities and safeguard their right to access and manage the community's own resources. Development processes in the tribal areas need to be balanced by the preservation of tribal identity, culture, and values. Like the times of COVID have already shown to us that it is very much essential for us to have an indigenous way of life, or it is very essential for us to go back to nature. In what and how, that is a very difficult question which we have. There are many ethical issues which arises out of it, that when we speak of development, when we speak of governance, what exactly it means and how we are going to take care of it. But again, this questions becomes important for us to address, and once we are able to address, then only we can have any real solution to the issues of tribal problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Namita. Thank you so much for giving us a different dimension. Though we are working on the project, so that is where I have come across to some of these kind of dimensions from you. But I'm sure many of the viewers and participants would like to know more about it, and they must have put the questions. So I will definitely pass on the questions to you later.
Thank you, Megha. Thank you, Dr. Megha. Thank you.
So now with this, I think we have come to the end to the first day's deliberations, and I know having 5 different deliberations from different fields and from different areas on climate change and environment governance have become little heavier for us to digest, but I'm sure it must have provoked many more thoughts amongst all of us. But with this, I think we will proceed to tomorrow's deliberations too. And I think tomorrow in the morning, we will start at 11 o'clock once again from the same link which is sent to you. You can log in or you can view it on YouTube. So thank you so much for all those presenters, for all those speakers who have really raised many thoughts and given us so many different aspects to think about environment governance and climate change in the future course of time. So with this, I think we can wind up for today's session. Thank you very much, all of you. Let's meet tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. Thank you.